There are some stories that are almost too difficult to tell, not because they are complicated, but because the truth they contain is so deeply unsettling that even speaking the words aloud feels like peeling back a layer of something that was never meant to be seen. Tonight, we are going to talk about children who were born into captivity, children who entered this world not in hospitals or warm homes, but in basements, backyard sheds, and locked rooms. These are true stories, and every single one of them will stay with you. In the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten, about 70 miles west of Vienna, there was a house on a residential street called Ybbstrasse. It was number 40. From the outside, it looked like any other European family home, a 3-story building with a neat exterior, shuttered windows, and a small garden. The neighbors knew the man who lived there as Josef Fritzl, a retired electrical engineer in his 70s who seemed, by all outward appearances, to be a perfectly ordinary grandfather. He and his wife Rosemarie had raised several children in that house, and in recent years, they had also taken in what appeared to be 3 foundling grandchildren, babies that had supposedly been left on their doorstep by their daughter Elizabeth, who they told everyone had run away years earlier to join some kind of religious cult. It was a strange story, certainly, but Amstetten was a small town where people minded their own business, and Joseph was persuasive enough to make it all seem plausible. The local social services had even visited the home and written glowing reports about how lovingly Joseph and Rosemarie cared for the children. They noted that the couple encouraged the kids, provided them with books and toys, and maintained a warm household environment. Everything seemed perfectly fine on the surface. But beneath that surface, beneath the floorboards and the concrete and the reinforced walls that Joseph had spent years constructing with his own hands, there existed a world so horrifying that when it was finally revealed to the public in April of 2008, it sent shockwaves across the entire globe. Joseph had been planning this dungeon for years, methodically expanding the cellar beneath his home, pouring concrete, installing soundproofing, and adding room after room, while telling anyone who asked that he was simply renovating. He applied for and received building permits from the local council, who never questioned the scale of the underground construction. He was meticulous, obsessive even, and the result was a hidden underground complex that was virtually invisible from the surface. Tenants who lived in an apartment on the first floor of the building had no idea what existed beneath them. When they occasionally heard strange sounds, Joseph explained them away as noisy pipes and a faulty heating system. His wife, Rosemarie, was forbidden from ever going to the basement. Joseph claimed it was his personal workshop, his domain, and she apparently never questioned it. Because what nobody knew, what not a single neighbor or social worker or family friend had any idea about, was that Joseph Fritzl's own daughter, Elizabeth, had never left home at all. She had never joined a cult. She had never abandoned her children. Instead, for 24 years, she had been imprisoned in a windowless dungeon that her father had built beneath the family home. A sprawling underground prison that he had expanded over the years into a series of cramped rooms, a kitchen area, a bathroom, and sleeping quarters. And in that dungeon, subjected to relentless abuse at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her, Elizabeth had given birth to 7 children. 7 children conceived through repeated assaults by her own father, and 3 of those children had never, not once in their entire lives, seen natural daylight. The nightmare began on August 28th, 1984. Elizabeth was 18 years old. Her father told her he needed help carrying a door down to the basement, the final piece of a construction project he'd been working on, She had no reason to suspect anything unusual, so she went downstairs to help. Once they were in the basement, Joseph pressed an ether-soaked towel against her face until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she was inside the chamber, and the heavy reinforced door was sealed shut behind her. To reach the area where Elizabeth was being held, a person would have had to pass through 8 separate doors, 2 of which were secured with electronic locking devices operated by a remote control that only Joseph possessed. The final entrance was a small steel hatch concealed behind a heavy shelf in his basement workshop. It was, by any measure, an inescapable prison. After Elizabeth's disappearance, Joseph reported her missing. He even handed police a letter, the first of several he had forced Elizabeth to write while in captivity. The letter was postmarked from another town and said she was tired of living with her family and was staying with a friend. She warned her parents not to look for her, or she would leave the country entirely. The police accepted this explanation, and the search was called off. Rosemarie, Elizabeth's mother, apparently accepted the story as well and moved on with her life. For the next 5 years, Elizabeth was completely alone in that cellar, with no one but her father, who would descend the stairs to assault her, sometimes staying overnight, and then return upstairs to carry on with his normal life, as though nothing was happening. Then the children started coming. Elizabeth's first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. But in August of 1988, 4 years into her captivity, she gave birth to a girl she named Kirsten. She delivered the baby entirely alone, with no medical assistance whatsoever, guided only by a book about pregnancy that Joseph had grudgingly provided, along with scissors, a blanket, and some diapers. He didn't even bother to check on Elizabeth and the newborn for 10 days after the birth. About a year and a half later, in February of 1990, a second child was born, a boy named Stefan. Then came Lisa in August of 1992. Joseph decided there wasn't enough room in the cellar for another child, so he took Lisa upstairs and staged a scenario in which the baby appeared to have been left on the Fritzl's doorstep with a note from Elizabeth. Social services were called, and Joseph and Rosemarie were allowed to adopt the child. This would happen twice more over the years, with 2 additional children, Monica and Alexander, being brought upstairs under the same ruse. The captives had a television set, a radio, and a video cassette player, amenities that Joseph provided not out of kindness, but as tools of control. The food could be stored in a small refrigerator and heated on hot plates, but the rations were meager and inconsistent. When Joseph was angry, or when he felt the family had disobeyed him in some way, he would shut off the electricity entirely, plunging them into total darkness, or refuse to deliver food for days at a time. He told Elizabeth and the 3 children who remained underground that if they ever tried to tamper with the cellar door or attempt to escape, they would be gassed. Investigators later confirmed that this was an empty threat. There was no gas supply connected to the basement, but it was devastatingly effective as a psychological weapon. He also warned them they would be electrocuted if they touched the door mechanisms. The children had no reason to doubt him. They had never known any world other than the one he had created for them, and in that world, his word was absolute law. Meanwhile, Kirsten and Stefan remained underground with their mother. They had never breathed fresh air, never felt sunlight on their skin, never seen the sky. Elizabeth tried desperately to give them some semblance of a normal childhood. She taught them to read and write using the limited materials her father provided. She decorated the walls of the dungeon, told them stories, and did everything she could to fill their world with something other than the cold, damp concrete that surrounded them. But there was only so much she could do. Stefan grew taller than the ceiling of the dungeon and developed a permanent stoop from years of being unable to stand fully upright. Kirsten was sickly for much of her life and would sometimes have fits during which she would shred her own clothing. And the children were present whenever their father descended into the cellar to assault their mother, which he did an estimated 3,000 times over the course of her captivity. In 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins. One of them, a boy named Michael, died just 3 days after birth. Without any medical care, without a hospital, without so much as a sterile environment, the infant simply didn't survive. Joseph later admitted to police that he had incinerated the baby's body in the furnace of the family home. The other twin, Alexander, survived and was taken upstairs. Then, in 2002, the last of Elizabeth's children was born, a boy named Felix. By this point, Joseph decided that Rosemarie couldn't handle raising another child, so Felix remained in the basement. That meant that by 2008, 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, had spent their entire lives underground in a space that measured roughly 600 square feet, with ceilings barely over 5.5 feet high. They had no concept of the outside world. They communicated in unusual ways, sometimes in grunts and gestures rather than full sentences. They had no immune systems to speak of, no social skills, and no understanding of what life was supposed to look like. The dungeon's discovery came about only because of a medical emergency. In April of 2008, Kirsten, who was 19 years old and had been sickly her entire life, became gravely ill. She developed terrible cramps and would bite her lips until they bled. Elizabeth begged her father to allow Kirsten to be taken to a hospital, and remarkably, he agreed. He brought Kirsten to the Amstetten Hospital, but her condition baffled the doctors. They had never seen a patient quite like her, someone who appeared to have no history of medical care, no exposure to sunlight, and a constellation of mysterious symptoms. They put out a public appeal for her mother to come forward to help save her life. And incredibly, Joseph allowed Elizabeth to leave the cellar and go to the hospital, perhaps believing he could control the situation. But once Elizabeth was alone with the police, she made a deal. If they promised she would never have to see her father again, she would tell them everything. And so she did. The story that poured out of Elizabeth was so staggering, so incomprehensible, that the officers who heard it could barely process what they were being told. 24 years, a dungeon beneath a family home, 7 children, 3 of whom had never seen daylight, thousands of assaults, a dead infant incinerated in a furnace. It was, in every sense, beyond imagination. Josef Fritzl was arrested that same night. He initially tried to maintain his lies, but eventually confessed to his crimes. His trial began in March of 2009 at the court in St. Poppelton. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including rape, incest, false imprisonment, and negligent homicide for the death of baby Michael. He was sentenced to life in a psychiatric institution. During the trial, it was also revealed that Joseph had a prior criminal history. He had been convicted of assaulting a woman in 1967 and had served time for it, though that conviction was eventually expunged from his record. He was also reportedly a suspect in several other cases, including the assault and death of a teenage girl who bore a resemblance to Elizabeth. In the years following their rescue, Elizabeth and her 6 surviving children were given new identities and relocated to an undisclosed village in northern Austria, referred to only as Village X. The home where they now live is under constant surveillance. All of the children require ongoing therapy. The three who grew up in the basement have faced the most significant challenges, struggling to adapt to a world they never knew existed. One of the boys reportedly saw the moon for the very first time the night he was removed from the dungeon by police. When the hospital staff introduced the basement children to their siblings who had grown up upstairs, the children connected almost instantly. It was, by all accounts, an emotional reunion. But the road ahead would be long and painful, and the scars of what happened at Yibstrasse 40 would never fully heal. And as disturbing as the Fritzl case was, it was far from the only time something like this had happened. Across the Atlantic, in a sun-drenched California neighborhood, another nightmare had been unfolding for nearly 2 decades, hidden behind fences and tarps in a sprawling backyard compound. On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard was walking to her school bus stop in South Lake Tahoe, California. It was a warm morning, the kind of day that should have been completely forgettable, just another Tuesday before a 5th grade field trip. J.C.'s stepfather, Carl Probin, was watching from the driveway as she walked up the hill toward the bus stop. He saw a gray sedan pull up alongside her. A woman was driving. A man in the passenger seat reached out and in one swift motion stunned J.C. with a stun gun. She crumpled and the car sped away. Carl tried to chase the vehicle on his bicycle but couldn't keep up. Within minutes, J.C. was gone. Her stepfather's frantic 911 call launched a massive search. Flyers were printed. Her face was broadcast across the news. Tips came in from across the country. But none of them led anywhere. The case went cold, and for 18 agonizing years, J.C.'s mother, Terry Probin, never gave up hope that her daughter was alive somewhere. She kept J.C.'s bedroom exactly as it was. She replayed that morning over and over in her mind, tormented by the memory that she hadn't kissed her daughters goodbye before leaving for work that day. What no one knew was that J.C. had been taken by a man named Philip Garrido and his wife, Nancy. Philip was a registered sex offender who had previously been convicted and imprisoned for kidnapping and assaulting a woman in 1976. He had been released on parole, and despite being under the supervision of both federal and state parole systems, he managed to kidnap an 11-year-old girl and hide her for 18 years without anyone noticing. After the abduction, J.C. was brought to the Garrido home in Antioch, California, about 170 miles from where she was taken. The property was a sprawling mess of sheds, tents, and tarps in the backyard, hidden behind tall wooden fences that Philip had built to an 8-foot height, specifically to conceal what was behind them. From the street, the house looked unremarkable, a single-story home in a working-class neighborhood. But the backyard was a labyrinth of makeshift structures, some connected by tarps, others standing alone, a hidden compound that grew over the years as Philip expanded it to accommodate his captive, and eventually her children. J.C. was initially kept handcuffed in a small structure in the backyard, a shed with no windows and a bolted door. She was given a blanket and told nothing about where she was or what was going to happen to her. She was 11 years old, terrified, and completely alone. She remembers trying not to cry because, with her hands cuffed behind her back, she couldn't wipe her tears, and they would itch as they dried on her face. Her only companion in those early days was a spider she named Bianca. She would talk to Bianca, watching her build webs in the corner of the shed, and for a brief time, that spider was the only living thing in the world that she felt any connection to. The Garridos told J.C. that they had to keep her because her family didn't want her anymore, a lie designed to break her spirit and make her dependent on them. Over time, she was given a new name, Alyssa, and forbidden from ever writing or saying her real name again. The Garridos even gave her kittens on 2 occasions, gifts that would mysteriously disappear, a form of psychological manipulation designed to deepen her sense of helplessness. When Philip discovered she had written her real name in a journal she was keeping about the kittens, she was forced to tear out the page. It was the last time she was permitted to use her real name until the day she was finally rescued. 3 years into her captivity, when JC was only 13 years old, the Garridos told her she was pregnant. She had no understanding of how pregnancy worked, no knowledge of what was happening to her body. She had been a 5th grader when she was taken, a child who knew nothing about the realities of sex or reproduction. And now, at 14, she went into labor in a locked room in the backyard compound. She described not even knowing she was in labor, just feeling scared and in tremendous pain. She delivered her first daughter entirely alone, with no medical assistance. When the baby arrived and she saw her face for the first time, something shifted inside JC. She later said she felt like she wasn't alone anymore, that she finally had someone who was hers. In 1997, at 17, she gave birth to a second daughter. The girls were raised to call the Garridos mom and dad, and to believe that JC was their older sister. They had no birth certificates, no social security numbers, no medical records, and no formal education. JC, drawing on the limited schooling she'd received before her abduction, set up a makeshift school in the compound and taught her daughters everything she could. She created lessons, played games with them, and tried to give them a childhood within the confines of their prison. The irony was painful. JC herself had been robbed of her childhood, and now she was trying to manufacture one for her daughters using nothing but love and determination. Throughout the 18 years, there were multiple opportunities for JC to be found. In 2006, a neighbor called 911 to report that there were children living in tents in the Garrido backyard and that Philip was behaving erratically. A deputy sheriff came to the property, spoke with Philip at the front door for about 30 minutes, and left without ever entering the backyard or discovering JC and her children. Parole officers visited the home regularly to check on Philip, who was required to submit to drug tests and monitoring, but not one of them ever discovered the compound of sheds and tents where 3 people were being held. JC later said she even spoke to one of the parole agents, but the agent simply gave Philip his drug test and left. The discovery finally came in August of 2009, 18 years after JC was taken. Philip brought his 2 daughters, now 14 and 11, to the University of California, Berkeley campus, where he was trying to get a permit to hold a religious event. Campus security officers found his behavior strange and ran a background check, discovering his sex offender status. His parole officer called him in for a meeting. Philip arrived with Nancy, the 2 girls, and JC, still going by the name Alyssa. During questioning, JC was defensive and agitated, telling officers that Philip was a changed man and a great person, and insisting the girls were her daughters. She was terrified that if she revealed the truth, her children would be taken from her. It was only after Philip himself admitted to kidnapping and assaulting JC that she finally identified herself. Her first words after confirming her real identity were to ask that someone call her mother. The phone call between JC and Terry Probin was raw and overwhelming. Terry screamed when she heard the news. JC, through tears, told her to come quickly. Terry later told interviewers that she remembered telling her daughter she was coming, over and over, while both of them sobbed. It was the moment Terry had waited 18 years for, and the moment JC had dreamed about every single day in captivity. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. JC received a $20 million settlement from the state of California for the catastrophic failures of the parole system that allowed her captivity to continue for nearly 2 decades. She has since written 2 books about her experience and has dedicated her life to helping other survivors of abduction and abuse. And while J.C. Dugard's rescue made headlines around the world and offered a rare moment of hope in the landscape of these kinds of stories, just 4 years later, another case would emerge from a quiet neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, one that would prove just as horrifying and just as difficult to comprehend. On August 22, 2002, 21-year-old Michelle Knight disappeared from a street in Cleveland. She had been on her way to a meeting about a custody case involving her young son, Joey, who was in state care. She stopped at a grocery store where she ran into a man named Ariel Castro, a familiar face from the neighborhood. He was the father of a girl she knew. He offered her a ride, claiming he could help her find the social worker's office. Instead, he drove her to his house at 2207 Seymour Avenue, a modest 2-story home in the city's Tremont neighborhood. Once inside, he lured her upstairs with the promise that she could take a puppy home to her son. When she went upstairs, he overpowered her, tied her up with extension cords, and trapped her in a room. Michelle later described being bound like a fish, with an extension cord around her neck. She was 21 years old, but she was small, barely 5 feet tall, and weighing less than 100 pounds. She was completely at his mercy. What made Michelle's disappearance even more tragic was that no one came looking for her. Her family assumed she had run away because she was upset about losing custody of her son. The police spent limited resources investigating, and 15 months after she vanished, she was quietly removed from the FBI's National Crime Information Center database. She essentially ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. And Castro knew it. He taunted her about it daily, telling her that nobody cared about her, that nobody was searching for her, and that she should be grateful he'd taken her in. In April of 2003, Castro abducted his second victim, 16-year-old Amanda Berry. Amanda was walking home from her shift at a Burger King restaurant the day before her 17th birthday when she spotted Castro's familiar-looking van. She knew some of his children, and he used this connection to disarm her, offering her a ride. She accepted, and like Michelle before her, she never made it home. Amanda's disappearance made significantly more news. Her face was on television. Her mother, Luana Miller, held vigils and pleaded publicly for her daughter's return. Heartbreakingly, a week after Amanda disappeared, someone used her cell phone to call her mother and tell her that Amanda was fine and would come home. That caller was Ariel Castro himself. Then, on April 2nd, 2004, 14-year-old Gina DeJesus became Castro's third victim. Gina was actually a friend of Castro's daughter, Arlene. On the day she was taken, Gina had been with Arlene, and when their plans fell through, she headed home alone. She ran into Castro, who told her he could take her to see Arlene. She trusted him. She got in the car. She never made it home. In a bitter twist, Castro's own son, Anthony, who was a student journalist at the time, actually wrote an article about Gina's disappearance and interviewed her grieving mother for the story. For the next 9 years, the 3 women were held prisoner inside Castro's house. They were initially chained in the basement, bound by ropes and heavy chains. Castro had a system of control that was both physical and psychological. He would alternate between cruelty and small acts of what he considered kindness, a cycle designed to keep his victims off balance and dependent on him. Over time, the women were moved to separate rooms on the second floor, with the windows boarded up and replaced by solid wood so that no light could enter and no sound could escape. Each room was essentially a sealed cell. The doors were padlocked from the outside, and the women had no way of communicating with each other or with the outside world. When Castro had visitors, including his own family members, he would move the women to the attic, tie them up, tape their mouths shut, and blast music to cover any sounds they might make. His friends and relatives came and went from that house for years, never suspecting that 3 kidnapped women and, eventually, a child were being held just floors away from where they sat and talked and laughed. They were fed 1 meal a day, usually something cheap and barely nutritious. They were allowed to shower twice a week at most. They used plastic buckets as toilets, which were emptied infrequently, leaving the house steeped in a smell that the women could never escape. The conditions were filthy and degrading beyond description. Castro kept diaries that prosecutors later recovered, written by the women, which spoke of forced encounters, being locked in dark rooms, anticipating the next session of abuse, dreaming of escape, being treated like animals, and missing the lives they once had. Castro subjected all 3 women to repeated assaults, but Michelle bore the worst of his violence. She later said she believed he targeted her specifically because she refused to be broken, because she stood up to him, and because no one was looking for her. Over the course of her 11 years in captivity, Michelle became pregnant at least 5 times. Each time, Castro forced a miscarriage through savage physical abuse, starving her for days and then punching and kicking her in the stomach, jumping on her with his full body weight, and striking her with dumbbells. The violence was so severe that medical experts later testified she could have easily died from any one of these incidents. Castro would then blame Michelle for the loss, telling her she had killed his child. Amanda Berry, however, was allowed to carry 1 pregnancy to term. She realized she was pregnant around her 20th birthday and was terrified. She was barely eating, chained to a wall, using a bucket for a bathroom. How could she possibly bring a child into this world? But on Christmas Day, 2006, Amanda went into labor. Castro forced Michelle to serve as the midwife. He told Michelle that if the baby died, he would kill her. The delivery was agonizing, and when the baby girl, named Jocelyn, finally arrived, she wasn't breathing. Michelle, who had some basic knowledge of infant care from having her own son before her abduction, leaned down and breathed into the newborn's mouth, performing CPR until the baby began to breathe on her own. It was a moment of extraordinary courage under unimaginable pressure, and it likely saved Jocelyn's life. Jocelyn grew up inside that house, knowing nothing of the outside world except what she could glimpse through the cracks. She saw the chains on her mother's wrists, which Castro told her to call bracelets. When she was about 2 or 3 years old, Castro finally removed Amanda's chains, largely because of Jocelyn. The little girl had a humanizing effect on him in some ways, though it didn't extend to his other victims. Castro occasionally took Jocelyn outside, to the park or to church, claiming she was his granddaughter or the daughter of his girlfriend. He made sure she never knew Michelle's or Gina's real names, in case she mentioned them to someone outside the house. Amanda created a pretend world for Jocelyn, setting up an imaginary school, where they would go through the motions of a normal morning routine, pretending to leave the house, walking to a street, looking both ways for cars, and then crossing. All of it happening in one room of a boarded-up house on Seymour Avenue. The escape came on May 6th, 2013. Castro had left the house and for the first time had forgotten to lock the heavy interior door. Jocelyn, who was 6 years old, noticed the door was unlocked and told her mother. Amanda saw her chance. She went to the outer storm door and began screaming and pounding on it. A neighbor named Charles Ramsey heard the commotion and came over. Together, they kicked out the bottom panel of the storm door, and Amanda crawled through, pulling Jocelyn out behind her. Amanda ran to a neighbor's phone and dialed 911. Her voice, frantic and disbelieving, crackled over the line with words that would be replayed millions of times around the world. She said she was Amanda Berry, that she had been kidnapped, that she had been missing for 10 years, and that she was free. When police arrived at the house, they found Gina and Michelle barricaded in their upstairs rooms. The women didn't know Amanda had escaped. They didn't know help was coming. When officers shouted that they were police, the women had no reason to believe it. The neighborhood was rough, drug crime was common, and they had been lied to so many times before. But when the officers broke through, Michelle literally launched herself into the arms of the first policeman she saw. The first words out of her mouth were that they were going home. Castro was arrested in a nearby parking lot within hours. He was charged with over 900 criminal counts, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder for the forced termination of Michelle's pregnancies. He pleaded guilty as part of a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison, plus 1,000 years with no possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, Michelle addressed him directly. She told him he had taken 11 years of her life, but she had gotten it back. She told him his hell was just beginning, and that she would not let him define her. 1 month into his sentence, Castro was found dead in his prison cell. He had hanged himself with his bed sheets. Some called it a coward's way out. Michelle was among them. In the years since their rescue, all 3 women have worked to rebuild their lives. Amanda Berry joined a Cleveland television station where she hosts a segment focused on missing persons cases. Gina DeJesus founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to missing and exploited children, deliberately locating its headquarters on the same block as the house where she was held captive because she wanted to bring something positive to that street. Michelle Knight changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, got married, and has written multiple books about her experience. Jocelyn, the little girl born on Christmas Day in a house of horrors, is now a teenager. She has grown up loved and protected by her mother, and by all accounts, she is thriving. Amanda has said that despite the circumstances of Jocelyn's conception and birth, she never once looked at her daughter and saw anything other than her own child. She is hers. But if the cases we've discussed so far share a common thread, it's that the victims were strangers to their captors, or at least started out that way. The relationship between captor and victim was imposed through violence and coercion. What makes the next case so deeply disturbing is that the prison was the family home, and the captors were the children's own parents, the people who were supposed to love and protect them more than anyone in the world. David and Louise Turpin lived in Paris, California, a quiet, sun-bleached community in Riverside County, about 70 miles east of Los Angeles. To the outside world, they seemed like a quirky but loving family. David worked as an engineer, and Louise was a stay-at-home mother to their 13 children. They renewed their wedding vows regularly at a chapel in Las Vegas, sometimes in Elvis-themed ceremonies, and they would bring all 13 kids along. The girls dressed in matching pink dresses with white tights and heels, the boys in dark suits with white shirts and red ties. They posted photos on social media that showed a picture-perfect family. Their children appeared obedient, well-dressed, and happy. But behind the closed doors of their home at 160 Muir Woods Road, those 13 children, ranging in age from 2 to 29, were living in conditions that can only be described as medieval. The house reeked of filth. The children were severely malnourished, so emaciated that when police arrived, they initially thought the 29-year-old was a minor. The children were allowed to eat only one meal a day, portions so small they were barely enough to sustain life. Their parents would bake pies and leave them on the counter where the children could see and smell them, but the children were forbidden from eating them. They would buy toys and leave them in packages, unopened, as a form of psychological torment, dangling normalcy just out of reach. As punishment for real or imagined infractions, the Turpin children were restrained, first with ropes, and when one child managed to wriggle free, with chains and padlocks. They were shackled to their beds for weeks and sometimes months at a time, without access to a bathroom. They were beaten, choked, and strangled. One daughter was reportedly the victim of a lewd act by her father. The children were forced to live on a reverse schedule, staying awake all night and sleeping during the day. They were rarely allowed outside, and when the family did venture out for photos or vacations, the children were silent and obedient, speaking only when spoken to, their only defense being invisibility. One neighbor described them as children who seemed to skip rather than walk, pale and thin, like ghosts moving across the yard. David claimed to be homeschooling the children through a registered private school, the Sandcastle Day School, which existed only on paper. He filed annual affidavits with the California Department of Education, asserting that his children were receiving a proper education, lies that would later result in perjury charges. In reality, the children received virtually no education. Several of the older children could barely read or write. They had no understanding of basic life skills, no knowledge of how to use money, how to navigate a neighborhood, how to cook, how to make a phone call, or how the world outside their home functioned. They had almost no concept of normal social interaction. The only activity they were freely allowed to engage in was writing in journals, and investigators would later recover hundreds of them, filled with the children's thoughts, fears, and desperate wishes for freedom. Those journals became key evidence in the prosecution. The children were kept in total isolation, a manufactured world where their parents controlled every aspect of their existence. Only one son was occasionally permitted to attend classes at a community college, but even he was accompanied at all times by his mother, who ensured he had no unsupervised contact with anyone. The family had moved frequently over the years, from Texas to California, changing addresses dozens of times in what investigators believe was a deliberate strategy to avoid detection. Before California, when the family had lived in a rural property in Rio Vista, Texas, the Turpin parents had at one point moved 10 of their children into an isolated trailer on the property and then left them there, bringing groceries on a weekly basis, but never enough food to feed everyone. One of the daughters, Jordan, who was only 6 years old at the time, later said there was a lot of starving, and she had resorted to eating ketchup, mustard, or ice just to put something in her stomach. When the family finally left the Rio Vista property, neighbors who entered the home found feces smeared on surfaces, beds with ropes tied to them, dead cats, and piles of garbage. The Turpins' downfall came because of Jordan, the same girl who had once eaten condiments to survive. By 2018, Jordan was 17 years old. She had been planning an escape with her siblings for more than 2 years, quietly gathering courage and information. She had managed to get her hands on a deactivated cell phone that her parents didn't know about. When she overheard her parents discussing a plan to move the family to Oklahoma, she knew it was now or never. On the night of January 14th, 2018, Jordan and one of her younger sisters climbed out of a window. The younger girl became frightened and turned back, but Jordan kept going. She ran until she was far enough from the house, and then she dialed 911. Jordan's voice on that call was shaky but determined. She told the dispatcher that her parents were abusive, that her sisters were chained to their beds, and that the smell in the house was so bad she could sometimes barely breathe. When the first officer arrived, Jordan showed him photos she had taken on the phone, images of her siblings in chains, images of the filth and squalor inside the house. When officers entered the home, they found the children in dark, foul-smelling surroundings. Some were shackled to their beds and furniture with chains and padlocks. Many told officers they were starving. The officers initially mistook several of the adult children for minors because of how severely malnourished they were. The 29-year-old weighed only 82 pounds. Even the responding officers, hardened professionals who had seen difficult things in their careers, were visibly shaken by what they found. David and Louise Turpin were arrested and charged with a staggering array of felonies, including torture, false imprisonment, child abuse, and dependent adult abuse. David was additionally charged with a lewd act on a child. They pleaded guilty in February of 2019 and were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, several of the Turpin children addressed the court. One daughter said her parents had taken her whole life from her, but she was taking it back. A son said he couldn't describe in words what they went through, but that the past was the past, and he had learned to ride a bike and was riding everywhere now. The statements were heartbreaking in their simplicity, young people finding joy in things most people take for granted, because they had been denied even the most basic freedoms for their entire lives. But tragically, the nightmare didn't end with the rescue. After being freed from their parents, the younger Turpin siblings were placed in the foster care system, and some of them ended up in a home run by a family named Olguin. The Olguin foster parents subjected the children to further abuse, including physical violence, and in the case of the foster father, sexual abuse. The man was later sentenced to 7 years in prison, while his wife and daughter received probation. The Turpin siblings had escaped one house of horrors only to be placed in another, a devastating failure of the systems that were supposed to protect them. Several of the siblings have since filed lawsuits against Riverside County and the foster care agency responsible for their placement. Jordan Turpin, now in her 20s, has moved into her own apartment and has said that sometimes she walks in the door and can't believe it's real. And as staggering as the Turpin case was in its scale, there was another story unfolding across the ocean, one that had been hidden for even longer, and that the world might never have learned about, were it not for the Fritzl case making international headlines in 2008. In a small village called Coulommiers, about 30 miles east of Paris, France, a woman named Lydia Guardo had been living in silent captivity for nearly 3 decades. Her story didn't involve a reinforced basement or a hidden dungeon. Instead, it played out in an attic behind shuttered windows in a house where the neighbors knew something was wrong, but never said a word to the authorities. Lydia was born in 1962 in Maison-Alfort, a suburb of Paris. Her biological mother died when she was young, and she was raised by her stepfather, Raymond Guardo, and his wife, Lucienne. The abuse began when Lydia was just 8 years old. It started with physical violence, beatings that escalated in severity. One day, her stepmother plunged her into a scalding bath, inflicting third-degree burns that were so severe she had to be pulled out of school. That isolation from the outside world marked the beginning of Lydia's imprisonment. From that point on, she was kept at home, hidden away from teachers, classmates, and anyone who might have noticed what was happening to her. As Lydia grew older, Raymond began assaulting her. The attacks happened daily, morning, evening, and night, in the full knowledge of Lucienne, who not only failed to intervene, but actively participated in the abuse. The household was a place of absolute terror, ruled by a man who demanded total obedience and punished any form of resistance with extreme violence. If Lydia resisted or even hesitated, Raymond would burn her with boiling water or hydrochloric acid. The scars covered her body from her neck to her ankles, permanent reminders of the torture she endured, a roadmap of suffering that she would carry for the rest of her life. Her 2 older siblings eventually left the household when they were teenagers, one at 15 and the other at 18, leaving Lydia alone with Raymond and Lucienne. With no one else in the house to witness or intervene, the abuse intensified. Over the years, the assaults resulted in 6 pregnancies, and Lydia gave birth to 6 children, all fathered by her stepfather. The births occurred in the confined attic where she was imprisoned, without any medical care, assistance, or even basic hygiene. 6 days a week, Raymond would park his mobile printing truck in the parking lot of the local supermarket, where he produced business cards and flyers for local residents and shopkeepers. He was known around town. He had regular customers, and he was frequently accompanied by Lydia and the children, in plain sight of everyone. What made Lydia's case particularly devastating was the degree to which the community was aware of what was happening and chose to look the other way. Raymond operated a mobile printing business, parking his truck in the lot of the local supermarket 6 days a week. He would often be accompanied by Lydia and the children born from the assaults. Villagers openly gossiped about the true parentage of the children. Rumors circulated for years that Raymond had fathered children with his stepdaughter. Shopkeepers, neighbors, and even local officials were aware of the whispers. But no one took any action. No one reported their suspicions to the police. The information existed, scattered among dozens of people, but it never coalesced into a formal complaint. It was, as the title of Lydia's memoir would later put it, the silence of others. Lydia did attempt to escape on at least one occasion. She managed to get away and called a legal aid service for help, but Raymond tracked her down at a family residence in the nearby town of Melun and brought her back. She also ran away as a child when the beatings became too severe. But each time, the police returned her to Raymond's custody because she was a minor and he was her legal guardian. The very system that should have protected her kept delivering her back into the hands of her abuser. Lydia's imprisonment finally ended in November of 1999, but not through rescue or escape. Raymond Guardo died of a heart attack. It was only then, after nearly 28 years, that Lydia was finally free. But even after his death, the aftermath was slow and complicated. Police involvement was limited at first because the perpetrator was already dead. It wasn't until the Fritzl case exploded across international headlines in 2008 that Lydia felt empowered to tell her story publicly. She published a book called Le Silence des Autres, in which she detailed the decades of abuse and criticized the media, the authorities, and the villagers who had known about her suffering and done nothing to stop it. Lucienne, Lydia's stepmother, was eventually tried in a closed-door proceeding. She was convicted of failing to report the crime she was aware of and of committing sexual abuse against one of Lydia's children. She received a 4-year suspended sentence, a punishment that many felt was grossly inadequate given the scope of the crime she had enabled. Police also investigated Raymond for possible involvement in the murders of 4 other young women in the Paris area in 1987, though DNA evidence was inconclusive and his body had to be exhumed for testing. As of recent reports, Lydia still lives in the same house where she was held captive. She does not go up to the attic anymore. Her children, who were separated from her and raised within the extended family or placed in protective custody after Raymond's death, have faced severe developmental challenges. Lydia has said that she wanted to reach out to Elizabeth Fritzl, to tell her she understood, to let her know she wasn't alone. She said the two of them could support each other in ways that no one else could ever fully understand. These stories, as harrowing as they are, share a set of uncomfortable truths that we cannot look away from. In each case, the captivity was enabled not just by the cruelty of the perpetrators, but by the failures of the systems and communities around them. Social workers who wrote positive reports about homes where children were being tortured. Parole officers who visited properties where kidnapped women and children were being held and noticed nothing. Neighbors who heard strange sounds or saw unusual things and decided it wasn't their business. Police who received tips and complaints and failed to follow up. In every one of these cases, there were opportunities, sometimes dozens of them, to intervene, to ask one more question, to look a little harder, to knock on one more door. And in every case, those opportunities were missed. The children born into these nightmares had no choice in their circumstances. They entered the world in darkness, in silence, in pain. Some of them didn't survive. Some of them will carry the trauma of their first years for the rest of their lives. But many of them have found ways to move forward, to build lives that their captors never intended for them to have. Elizabeth Fritzl's children are growing up in a village where they are protected and cared for. J.C. Dugard's daughters went to college. Amanda Berry's daughter, Jocelyn, celebrated her sweet 16 in a pink Cinderella gown. Jordan Turpin has her own apartment and a future she's building from scratch. And Lydia Guardo is still standing, still speaking, still refusing to be silenced. These stories are hard to hear, but they matter because they remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary front doors, in quiet neighborhoods, in families that smile for photographs. And the pattern repeats in ways that are deeply unsettling. In England, a case emerged in 2008 that bore striking similarities to many of the stories we've already discussed. In Sheffield, a man who can never be publicly named due to court orders protecting his victims was convicted of raping his 2 daughters over a period of 25 years, beginning when the girls were just 8 and 10 years old. He fathered 7 surviving children with them. There had been 19 pregnancies in total, 5 miscarriages, 5 terminations, and 2 babies who died shortly after birth due to genetic abnormalities caused by the incest. The man, who called himself the Gaffer, ruled his family through violence and terror. If his daughters refused his advances, he would beat them, kick them, and hold their faces close to a gas fire until their skin burned. He moved the family around constantly, an estimated 70 times over the course of the abuse, shifting between small, isolated villages in northern England to avoid detection. His wife eventually left, abandoning the daughters to their father's cruelty. Their brother tried to report the abuse to the police in 1997, but officers dismissed his account as hearsay, and the sisters were too terrified to corroborate it. Over the course of 25 years, the family had contact with 28 different agencies and over 100 professionals, including doctors, social workers, and school administrators. Despite numerous pregnancies, visible injuries, and genetic disorders in the children that strongly suggested incest, not one of those professionals took definitive action. Doctors even advised the daughters to stop having children with whoever the father was because of the genetic risks, but never reported their suspicions to the authorities. The abuse only ended in 2008, when one of the daughters, who had by then found the courage through a relationship with a new partner, disclosed everything to a social worker in Sheffield. The man was arrested and sentenced to 25 concurrent life sentences. He showed no remorse and refused to even appear in the courtroom during his trial. That case, like so many of the others, revealed the devastating consequences of institutional failure, of professionals who saw warning signs and chose not to act, of communities that sensed something was wrong, but decided it was someone else's problem, and it underscored a truth that runs through every single one of these stories. The captivity of these children was not maintained by locks and chains alone. It was sustained by silence, by fear, by the collective failure of the people and systems that surrounded them. These stories matter because they remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary front doors, in quiet neighborhoods, in families that smile for photographs. And the only thing that stands between a child in danger and a child who is saved is someone who is willing to pay attention, to ask the uncomfortable question, to make the phone call, to refuse to look the other way. If these stories meant something to you, if they made you think or feel or look at the world a little differently, I'd ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling these stories, the ones that need to be heard even when they're difficult to listen to. Thank you for being here tonight. Stay safe and take care of the people around you. Good night.